Hello viewers and welcome to Novus Talks with me, your host Nova Scorpius. And welcome to a very special video. It is time to review Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. Those are words I never thought I'd say anytime soon. As you can see, I'm fully decked out, ready for the occasion. And before we begin, worth mentioning as well, got a nice Christmas Metroid sweater on Temu, of all places. Just wanted to throw that out there just to show you I'm going all in for this. So yeah, it's been nearly 2 months. I played Metroid Prime 4, then I got caught up playing Hyrule Warriors. I bought a Switch 2 during Black Friday, so I got caught up on that, which is why I'm a bit delayed here. But without further ado, just put that out there, there will be spoilers. So if you haven't beaten the game, or if you're halfway through and worried about spoilers, there will be spoilers. So just a heads up on that. Being announced 8 years ago, was Metroid Prime 4 Beyond worth the wait? Well, to start off with, I think it's only fitting to focus in on the core gameplay. The classic Metroid Prime gameplay of scanning, of slowly making your way through each environment, taking in the scenery, basic movements. How does all of that feel? And more importantly, how does it feel in comparison to the previous 3 games? And on that regard, the basic gameplay is the best that's ever been in Metroid Prime. Even though it's mostly the exact same, when locking on, you now have the option to strafe, which, while there in the previous games, I don't believe you could strafe forward and backwards. That is something that is new. And it makes quite a difference, because combat in Metroid Prime 4 is surprisingly difficult at times, especially if you're playing on hard mode. And so it becomes absolutely necessary to have that option of strafing around enemies and doing everything you can to, jump around the place, especially when fighting those Psybots. I found out of all the enemies in the game, those do the heaviest amount of damage. So you really have to be quick on your feet when dealing with them. Scanning, there's not much to say here. It's identical to the Prime trilogy. Great to have it back. Although I will say, probably as a side effect of just, it being 18 years since the last game, the writing on the scan logs feels weird. In the Prime trilogy, it felt like the scan logs are more scientific, or at the very least, they use a lot more complicated wording, whereas with Prime 4, it feels like they're trying the same thing, but instead of it being more succinct and compact, sentences and paragraphs are drawn out a bit more, and they kind of say the same thing in multiple different ways, basically. So they ultimately don't end up feeling as detailed as the scan logs from previous games. I haven't seen anyone else comment about that online, but that is something I felt from basically straight away starting the game. The level design. Now, one thing before I get into this that I'll bring up is that I see a lot of people online complaining that the game is too linear. Don't really share the sentiment of, yeah, it's linear, but all of Metroid is linear. I don't know if it's just the people that are obsessed with speed running that are getting annoyed by this, but that's kind of one facet that I don't really agree on. Sure, it is linear in the sense that you're just kind of going in a straight path, but you're still searching around the environment to find upgrades, to find new abilities, expansions. The classic Metroid gameplay, it's all there, just in a bit more of a tighter scenario, we'll say. Tanamar, very beginning of the game, probably the best intro since Prime 1. I was going to say the best intro Metroid has ever had, but I don't know, Prime 1's opening area was honestly perfect. It's very hard to top that. So I would say the opening section on Tanamar comes in close second place. You know, it's action-packed. It's the cinematic feel we've always wanted from Metroid but never had. And now the hardware is able to provide us that experience. So that feels very cool. You feel like you're really in the heat of it. And there's so many cool references in this opening section. I mean, obviously you've the Federation Force mechs. One of the scan logs mentions that some of the technology in this facility was reverse engineered from Talvania, which was one of the planets in Federation Force. So that's a cool bit of connective tissue there that's inconsequential, but it's a nice little lore nugget for fans who played all of the games. And the Abrax fight, you know, we've seen it 1,000 times in the previews. Quite fun. Definitely heavily reminiscent of the Berserker Lord, but I don't think it's a stretch to say Abrax is a way more fun boss than the Berserker Lord. Nothing wrong with the Berserker Lord, but Abrax kind of tests you in more avenues. You know, you're using the morph ball to duck under attacks, you're double jumping, the targeting, motion controls. Also, a quick side note, I did mostly play, when I was playing on television, I played with motion controls because, you know, that's classic Metroid Prime to me. But handheld, I played with stick controls, and that played perfectly fine as well. I did mostly play handheld, but when I was on TV, I did use motion controls. But yeah, the tutorial level ends how we all know it. You defeat Abrax, Psyux shows up with a pair of Metroids and some reinforcements, and then you all get teleported to Viros, which is the primary setting of the game. Right off the bat, the weirdest thing that struck me was Samus losing her abilities from the teleportation. Out of all the explanations in the series, this one makes the least sense. Like, I thought I missed something when the prompt came up saying that I was missing so many different upgrades. That just didn't make any sense and kind of took me out of the game for a moment, because, you know, Psyux still has everything he had on Tanamar, so why did Samus lose abilities? That didn't make any sense at all. But right away, anyway, you're teleported to Chrono Tower, and despite the ridiculous name, which, keep that in mind, keep the naming scheme in mind, because that's a point I'm going to bring up a lot as we go through the game. The naming convention for areas and for certain collectibles is very weird and lazy in a lot of ways. But we'll get to that. Going through the level, Chrono Tower, yeah, it's very atmospheric. You're thrown into it, complete mystery. At first you can't even scan most things because there's no data available. And the music is this kind of phasing in and out, and it has this kind of glitched, ethereal feel to it. Very cool stuff. I think a perfect introduction area. And then you meet the hologram of, I think is this Chitoya, one of the Lemorn priests, and you get the psychic gem and the psychic visor and psychic beam. The psychic visor at first doesn't really do anything other than giving you access to scan logs that you don't have with the regular visor. And the psychic beam is just your power beam, but purple. So there's really not much to say there other than them being aesthetic changes. Although you do get the option to upgrade the psychic beam later in the game, and it does become it becomes faster, and I believe it does more damage as well. The problem is you get that very late into the game, so it would have been nice if that upgrade was a lot sooner. Then you get teleported to Fury Green, which, apart from the stupid name, the really stupid name, this area is one of the best in the entire series. The music, the way it starts off with just the bell and then it opens up into that magnificent soundtrack that when I did my trailer reaction to the game, I called that the most beautiful piece of music I'd ever heard, and not really an overstatement because it's quite true. That music just hits you. It just hits you with the sense of awe and wonder, and I stood there taking in the lush rainforest cliffs, and the level design shines the most in this area of the game because, you know, even on Switch 1, I didn't test it, but from the footage I saw online, you know, just like Prime Remastered, this engine they used seems to shine best with foliage and rocks. You know, the tree branches and vines and even the rock faces themselves, they don't look or feel like level design. They feel like an actual world, a natural part of this ecosystem and environment, and it's just it gives you such a fantastic impression. And honestly, the game starts off on the strongest note possible with this area. It's just a shame it's so short. I believe this is the shortest area in the entire game apart from Chrono Tower and Tanamar, and it's a shame because I wish more of the game was set in Fury Green, because this is where a lot of that classic Metroid atmosphere and Retro Studios' finest work shines through in that area. It's just a shame that it's sort of a one and done for the most part. You get the psychic bombs. Forgive me if I can't remember the exact order of things. I'm just kind of going to be going through this review as I remember things. But you get the psychic bombs, and that's a very cool upgrade, because at first you get the ability to manipulate psychic motes, but then you're able to use your bombs and turn them into motes and toss them into energy conduits and stuff, and that's a really cool but underutilized ability, as is the ability to like manipulate different gateways and make space jump platforms appear. That's all really cool, if a bit underutilized. Meet Miles Mackenzie, which I almost got whiplash from this because the reviews and, you know, so-called critics and game journalists completely blew this character and all of the NPCs out of proportion. They were talking about, like, you know, Mackenzie is in the game for so long and he's constantly making MCU-style jokes, and yeah, when you first meet him, there is that like one line about being in a cubicle or something that he says, but other than that, he actually didn't piss me off as much as I expected. And all of the NPCs in general, they have about 5 minutes of screen time total in the game. Yes, the one point I do agree with is that when you're riding around Sol Valley, and don't worry, we'll get to Sol Valley, you know, the radio is quite annoying, especially when you're trying to collect the crystals and he just keeps saying, "Have you tried going to Fury Green yet?" The radio feels redundant because when you go into a different area and you try to use the radio, it doesn't work. So why it's even a thing is weird to me. Go through the area, you get the control beam, which a lot of people like. I don't. I think when you get the upgraded control beam that lets you fire it and move a lot faster, it's good. But the starter control beam is just annoying to me. It moves so slowly, and thankfully the only boss that really requires it is Carvex, which was obviously a bit of a throwback to Flagra. Carvex uses it, but other than that, you don't really need it for bosses. And outside of a few one-off puzzles here and there throughout the game, the control beam kind of becomes redundant from that point on. But as I said, when you get the upgrade that lets it move faster, it's fun to use. But before that point, it's kind of just, you're waiting for ages for this thing to just hit its target. Carvex as a boss fight, not much to say. It's really just a tutorial for the control beam. Nothing really special or all that memorable about it. So the weird thing is, and I'm going to touch on this point here, when scanning Carvex and scanning all the bosses, it mentions about them fusing with Metroids, how most of the bosses were guardian deities that were like, they gained psychic abilities, but then they got infected by Metroids and, became feral. Despite all of this, I was really baffled that you never encounter any Metroids in the game. Outside of that tutorial, they're nowhere to be found. And despite the fact that the gallery in the game has loads of different designs for different Metroids, and some of them are really cool looking, you never encounter any in the game. And I thought for sure we'd encounter some in Ice Belt or in the mines or whatever, but no, Metroids are completely absent, even though they would have gotten teleported to Viros as well. And the same for space pirates. Outside of Tanimir, you never encounter a single space pirate, nor are they mentioned even once on Viros. And it's even weirder still because the scan log, the logbook shows loads of empty spaces. Even when you've completed all scans throughout the game for all items and bosses, there's still empty gaps, blank spaces on each page, which makes it confusing at first, because I'm like, oh, did I miss certain scans? Is there a space pirate I missed? Or is there a boss enemy I missed? But no, it's just blank. And it gave me deja vu to Metroid Dread's map, where, there was one section of the map was missing, and we later learned that was because there was an entire area of the game cut from development. And obviously, you can put the pieces together here and see that a lot must have been cut from this game, because there's so many blank spaces in the logbook for stuff you never encounter or scan. And, the scans for the bosses mention fusions with Metroids, but you never even see this. All of this happens off screen. And it's so jarring. This is one of the biggest complaints I have, is that the lack of Metroids and space pirates after that intro doesn't make any sense and is incredibly jarring, because they would have got teleported too. So where are they? In fact, why isn't there more Federation stuff around? Large chunks of the research facility got teleported. So why isn't there any Federation ships teleported, or space pirate ships, etc.? It doesn't really make any sense in the slightest, and that was one of the few things that really bugged me throughout the game. But anyways, you finish Fury Green, and then you go on to Volt Forge, and I'm going to say it right away. Volt Forge is probably, it's one of the worst areas in the franchise. Without a doubt, this is the area where the visuals look really bad. Everything is flat, textures lack detail, the music is inconsistent. There's like 4 different themes, and some of them are really cool. Like when you activate the power, that music is really cool, but there's like 4 different tracks that play depending on where you are in the facility, and it just feels disorientating and messy. Previous games had one theme carrying you through an area, maybe 2, but to have like 3 or 4 just feels so weird and unnecessary. And as I said, Volt Forge, even the name is stupid. This area is just a bunch of small rooms and elevators, and that's it. This is where you acquire the Viola suit, which initially when I first saw the suit in the trailers, I didn't like it, but I've grown to really like it since. And you get Viola, the bike, And you can drive on the roads connecting the different towers, but your speed is limited. And once you enter back inside one of the buildings, you're immediately forced to dismount. And the trailer has talked about how you can use Viola in certain areas of the game still, but that's not really true, because 99% of the time you can't use Viola, even in big areas where you're supposed to be able to use it. And so it just becomes feeling pointless, because there's only like 2 of these roads, and they're so short that right as you're picking up speed, you're finished. And then you can't use the bike anywhere in the factory itself. And the entire level design exists just to explain why there's a motorbike, and that the Lemorn were just, I guess, mass producing motorbikes for reasons. It doesn't make sense from a gameplay perspective, and it doesn't make sense from a lore perspective. And so this entire area just feels really, really bad. Like, it feels like an early build of the game. It genuinely, this area fucking sucks. It's not fun to play through. It's just a bunch of elevators, and you're seeing bikes being assembled everywhere, and you get Viola, and as expected, Viola is tacked on, because you get the ability, you get a heat resistance for Viola later on when exploring the volcano, but it's only usable in that area, and Viola can transform into a hover mode, but that's it. And it's very interesting that the scan log for it mentions that there were more features planned. That, I don't know about you guys, but when I read that read to me like a statement from Retro themselves, rather than like an in-lore reason. And I believe it, because Viola just feels unnecessary. Why is this in the game? The answer is like, so you can traverse Sol Valley, but that's padding. If you cut out Sol Valley and add in fast travel, you have no reason for this bike. The only reason you can't fast travel in this game, and the reason is because they want you to use the bike, but the bike doesn't have any purpose other than that, and it doesn't really have any abilities to it, really. You have 2 boss fights on it, and one of them in the hover mode, but that's about it. Why it couldn't have been just the regular speed booster, I don't know, or you could have just cut Sol Valley entirely. And speaking of which, first thing I'm going to get out of the way is the thing about music. Sol Valley has ambient music, so the statement online that, oh, there's no music, you need to buy the amiibo to have music, is pure bullshit. I mean, yeah, it gives you optional music, but that music is just music from other Metroid games. Yeah, the thing that bugs me is that it locked skins behind the amiibo, but other than that, it's a non-issue. But so-called critics, aka game journalists who never play games, it seems, just wanted something to complain about. But it's true, Sol Valley exists only for bike traversal, because the area has literally nothing in it. There's Breath of the Wild style shrines, where you get upgrades to your elemental weapons, and we'll get into those as well, but it just feels, I know they did it because it's optional. It's meant to call back to Metroid Prime's optional missile upgrades and Super Metroid's optional abilities like the Crystal Flash, but it just feels kind of annoying, especially because the powerful versions of them, the super upgrades, are the last upgrades you get for those weapons. You get the charged variants first, and it's unnecessary. You could have cut out the charged variant, because the super variants do the same thing. Outside of them, there's nothing in Sol Valley. There's Federation ruins, but you can't explore them. There's parts of one of the mechs scattered, and you collect that late in the game. But I'd hardly call that something to do. That's more akin to, collecting the bomb components in Prime 3 on Elysia. There's nothing in Sol Valley. That area, Chrono Tower's smack bang in the middle, but it's cut off early in the game. So this area is completely redundant, has no purpose, and the enemies that appear while you're riding the bike are just flat out annoying. They don't add any value to the gameplay. In fact, quite the opposite. It drags down the experience and really waters down what the game should be and the tracks. And I get the impression that Retro Studios wanted to make classic Metroid Prime and Nintendo forced them to do an open world. And Retro pushed back, and eventually they had to do something, so they included a pseudo hub world, and that's why the bike is forced into the game but doesn't actually do anything. And the interview that came out with Famitsu, and we will talk about that as well, don't worry, kind of suggested some things that like Nintendo wanted open world, so it kind of confirmed my theory on that. And so Viola just ends up feeling completely unnecessary. And thankfully that's not a sentiment shared by me alone. And it's a shame because that seems to be like the main new gimmick of Prime 4 is Viola, which it's never even clear where the name comes from, why it's called that. And don't get me wrong, the bike looks cool. I mean, I even have the amiibo for it, for God's sake. It looks really cool, but it adds nothing to the gameplay experience, and it should have been cut, especially since you could have had Samus's gunship. One of my things that I wanted for years was space combat, but I guess we'll have to wait for another game. So that allows us to move on very quickly from that. The Ice Belt, again, I'm going to say this for almost all of the areas, but really stupid name. This area, really cool at first, really tense, and you know, they talk about the Grievers, which you encountered in Fury Green, and it's like, okay, these are really cool, and I can't wait to learn about them. And then it's exactly as expected. The Grievers are just Lemorn that were devolved. And that's the weird part. That's all the Lemorn lore is. There's nothing of substance to them. The only bit of storytelling you get with them is that they rained green energy onto the land and devolved themselves into monsters. And it's implied that this devolution is actually a different evolutionary branch they could have taken. They're just a shallow and uninteresting race. The only other thing you learn about them is that they rode around on motorbikes and that they're psychic. So where did they live? What was their societal structure like? You know, these are things you learned about the Chozo, the Luminoth, the Reptilicus, the Alimbics. Basically every other alien race in Metroid we know more about than we do the Lemorn. Or at least every main alien race anyways. So the Lemorn are ultimately very shallow and disappointing, and they're basically just the Reptilicus from Prime 3, but bad. You know, because the Reptilicus, you know, you learned about their societal structure, you learned how their civil war started and how they went from being intelligent beings to savage animals, you know. Even the design of the Grievers is basically the Reptilicus. So it really feels like they just reused that idea, but just did a worse job at explaining it. And it robs Prime 4 of having that new feeling to its alien race, because the Lemorn are just a shallow copy of the Reptilicus, a reskin, if you will. And that's all you learn about them. So it makes the discovery of the tension in the lab of just being Grievers feel disappointing. Because I thought for sure this is where Metroids were going to show up, or Space Pirates or something. But no, it's just, you know, this suspense and the atmosphere that's built is just for these Grievers that are just Lemorn, and they're not especially difficult. They go down in a couple of shots, and it's like, that's it? And then obviously you activate the generator, and similar to Volt Forge, really good music, but why is there like 4 different themes playing depending on which room I'm in? It's very annoying and messy. This is where you meet your first other NPC, Takabi. He's a lot of people's favorites. He looks a lot like Adam, which I thought was interesting. And yeah, he's an interesting character. You learn a lot about him. He helps you out quite a bit. And I think he's a pretty cool character. He's not... I don't find him annoying in the slightest. I think he's quite cool. Although it is interesting, his religion and, you know, learning that religion is a thing in Metroid is another interesting lore bit. That's the thing. You learn more about him and his backstory than you do about the entire Lemorn civilization. But yeah, Takabi, his whole personality is based around his religion and the god Solon. And this kind of confused me because the ending of the game, you know, he really beats it over the head with the mention of Solon. And it seemed like this was going to be a bigger deal. And when he gives his pendant to Samus at the end of the game, I thought there'd be significance in that other than it just being essentially a dog tag. Like, it felt like Solon was being introduced as some, like, an actual relevant figure in the world, but that wasn't the case in the slightest. So again, also a bit odd, but cool character building nonetheless. And that's all I can say about Ice Belt. And you're noticing I'm breezing through these areas because, yeah, there's not much to say about them. They look great, other than Vault Forge, but, you know, they're all so short and the lore therein is lacking and basically non-existent in some cases. And then Flare Pool, or as the game, the volcano has a name. The game calls it Magdrada Volcano. That's what it's called in lore, but for some reason Nintendo didn't use that name for the actual area. They called it Flare Pool, when Magdrada is not only a cooler name, it's more thematically fitting because, you know, the areas would presumably have the names that they were given by the Lemorn, the same way in Prime 1, you know, Phendrana Drifts. You can assume and infer that that's a name the Chozo who lived there gave to the place, you know. Imagine if they just called that, Phendrana Drifts was just called the Snow Wastes. You know, it's the exact same thing. It's like, you have this cooler and more appropriate name. Why aren't you using it? But Flare Pool anyways, again, the visuals shine here. The lava looks fantastic. It looks thick, looks globular, if that's a word. You know, all of that. You have a cool aerial fight with Psyux, who then, you see him escaping the shuttle, but then disappearing, and it's weird, like it's implied that's also a Cybot, but my impression playing it for the first time was that it was the real guy, so don't know what's up with that. You meet Duke and Armstrong in this area, and Duke is the best character in the game. Like, Duke is awesome, and I do find it really funny that two of the best human characters in Metroid are black. Him and Anthony, another M. Great characters. Anthony was more witty, whereas Duke is kind of more awkward in that he's trying to be serious, but he also has a soft side, and that's why, to me, he's the best character in the game, because he feels relatable in that sense. He feels like how a real soldier would feel, and, you know, he's duty-bound, he's professional, but he has a light-hearted side, and he's very compassionate. He just feels like the most fleshed-out character. And then Armstrong, surprisingly not as annoying as I expected. She is a bit of an annoying cliche, and there's sort of a weird father-daughter almost connection between the two of them that doesn't really get further explored, but she's relatively inoffensive. I'd say, you know, if Mackenzie's the weakest of the lot, then she's probably the second weakest character, because you don't really get much from her other than she's a Samus fangirl. Okay, like Duke, you learn about, you know, you see his personality showing through and his sense of responsibility, duty, but also compassion. And Tokabi, you see, you know, he's a hunter, and that mindset has stayed with him all his life. And, you know, his religion, his faith is very important to him. And, you know, these are character traits you see, whereas Armstrong, doesn't really have much going for her. And then I'll also use this to touch on the Android, VUI. I don't know how to pronounce this. The game doesn't really make it clear. VUI 995. An odd addition. I like him. Him and Duke are probably the best characters, but he feels odd because the game treats him both in lore and in a just gameplay sense as, he's a mass-produced robot, yet he has the game says he doesn't have feelings or emotions, yet he displays feelings and emotions, and it feels weird. His whole purpose is to pilot the mech, which in Federation Force they had people piloting the mechs. That was the whole purpose of that game. So he feels like a last-minute addition in that sense. And other than like his robotic mannerisms being awkward and funny, there's really nothing to him. So he's just another weird thing. And I hope you're seeing a trend here with me talking about Metroid Prime 4. But there's just so many things that just feel tacked on or feel weird and unnecessary and like they don't belong. And, that's one of the more minor offenses. Flare Pool as an area, pretty memorable. You go through these long kind of corridors with like they're narrow and they have the bars and you can see the area, and traveling around on tram, very cool. And it's a fun area to traverse, and I think it is the lengthiest area apart from the mines, so that lends it to being one of the more interesting. It's just that it doesn't really play around much with your abilities, which, I haven't really talked much about the psychic abilities at this point, because what is there to say? The psychic, it's just regular Metroid abilities given a psychic name. The whole game was marketed on this premise. It's literally the cover art of the game. Yet the psychic abilities, in terms of actual unique ones, there's like 2, right? The psychic boost ball is fun. And I love the fact that with the psychic, is it spider ball, I think it is, you can grapple with the ball. That's such a video game thing that makes no sense in lore, but it's so cool and it's so much fun. It's so silly. I love it. But other than that, there's nothing really memorable. The psychic space jump is just a double jump on invisible platforms. Power bombs are power bombs. It's just the uniqueness isn't there. And unlike Fury Green, where you were manipulating objects and doing puzzles, all of that seems to just kind of get pushed to the side after that opening area. And then the beams, or the lack thereof. First of all, the naming convention. What is it with things in this game having the most stupid and lazy names? Fire Shot? Ice Shot? Thunder Shot? Like, who is in charge of this? Because the names are so stupid, and it sounds even more cringeworthy when you have Mackenzie trying to hype you up. It's like, yeah, burn it all down with Fire Shot. And, even saying that just makes me uncomfortable. It's like, why isn't it the plasma beam, the ice beam, the wave beam, And they brought back the ammo system. Why? I can only imagine it's so that they could make a dozen different collectibles be hidden in Soul Valley and give you a reason to go there. But it's just annoying. I mean, yeah, you never really run out of ammo. It's a bit better in terms of management than Prime 2's ammo system was. But I think the only Metroid game that did the ammo system well was Hunters, because it kind of made sense in that game. But here it doesn't. You're using these beams as if, you were switching between beams in Prime 1 or Prime 2. So why they don't have the traditional names, or why they have ammo, I should say, just feels annoying. And I've already touched on the whole thing around the charged and super variants and how they should have been the same thing. It just feels like padding of just trying to throw out extra collectibles just for the sake of extra collectibles. So there's not much to really say about them other than, I mean, yeah, the Thundershot, especially the super variant, is super overpowered, and it's fun to use it against Psyux when he's using the shock coil on you. But other than that, there's nothing to say about them other than that they're a poor man's version of the classic Metroid beam weapons. So Flare Pool doesn't really make use of these things. Even the ability to freeze things. I think outside of like the first room, you never freeze anything in Flare Pool. So the ice weapon just becomes like redundant. And there's like 2 rooms you can use Viola in, but then you never use her in the rest of the area. So why is Viola there again? And then I suppose now is a good point at any to talk about green energy, because it comes up in the volcano, and apparently the volcano is where green energy was discovered and it's where it's mined from. I've seen some people online claiming it came on a meteor that impacted the planet, but there's never anything in the game that says that. In fact, it says that all the green energy that exists throughout the world came from the Lemoran dispersing it, right? First of all, why doesn't this thing have a name? Why is it just green energy? I can understand them at first being like, oh, hey, we discovered this green energy. But you'd think they'd have given it a name, you know? The Chozo called Phazon the Great Poison. And, you know, they called it that for a while. And I believe the Space Pirates call it the Mutagen. But then they eventually started calling it Phazon. So why don't you have a name here? And also, it's unclear what this stuff is. It kind of looks like Phazon, and it kind of does the same thing, sort of, but it doesn't seem to actually corrupt things other than just make them more aggressive. Like, it's implied that the psychic stones are what mutated the Lemoran. So green energy just feels weird. And again, that name, why is it called that? And the lore just feels so just lazy and lacking, like much of it was cut. It's like, okay, the Lemoran's whole thing is that they discovered green energy and for some inexplicable reason thought it was a good idea to disperse it in the atmosphere. And that's it. You know, I've seen a lot of people speculate that maybe this stuff is meant to be the new Phazon and it's going to carry on into Prime 5 and 6. And I doubt it. I could see that, but I doubt it at the same time because it just feels so one and done, you know? And the endgame fetch quest, Metroid Prime games, they all have it. A lot of people call the Green Crystal fetch quest the worst. I still think the Sky Temple keys are the worst fetch quests. Like, those were really annoying because you had to travel all across the map and there really wasn't any fast travel. The light suit only lets you teleport to limited areas and the start of each area basically, and you still had to make the rest of the journey on foot. Whereas here, at least all the crystals are condensed in one area in Sol Valley. I'm not saying they're fun to collect or anything. They're not. But they're mundane. They're just there. They're not annoying and they're not fun. They're just there. And yeah, there's a lot of them. And, you know, you get upgrades to your weapons and some of them are really cool. But they should have been upgrades you get sooner. It just feels weird, especially since, you know, it's just called green energy. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't really have a purpose beyond that. So I don't know what's up with that. Like the psychic abilities, it's something that just feels half-baked. Which is a great time to segue into the final area of the game, the Great Mines. I love this area. The mines, I think, are one of Metroid's best areas. The visuals shine through here and the rock formation and making it feel natural, and also the technology and equipment, and The grievers being attracted to sound, yeah, it can be annoying, but it's a unique gimmick that highlights the area, makes it stand out. What I thought was weird was having the boss of this area being named basically as a tribute to the Omega Pirate. And, you get the power bombs in this area and you fight this Omega-themed enemy. Yes, if you go to Fury Green, the altar where you can scan and learn about the history of all the different bosses and deities, obviously the Griever isn't mentioned. Instead, it mentions something called Gravanax, which, okay, sounds interesting, but you never see any trace or anything of this creature in the mines. All the other deities mentioned are the bosses you fight. Carvex, Zelios, Phaneros, or whatever it was called, which was a fun fight, by the way. But Gravanax doesn't get mentioned. It's like, okay, did Gravanax become the Omega Griever? Gravanax, it's implied the Grievers are Lemorn, so Gravanax wasn't Lemorn, so was it the first Griever? But that doesn't make sense because the Omega Griever wasn't born until very recently, because you see its cocoon earlier in the level. So again, the environmental storytelling is kind of going against and clashing with what the lore is trying to say. And again, there's not really anything to say about the boss. As the boss fights on the whole, I will say, some people call them the best fights in the franchise. There are some standouts. Psyux, which I'll get to, all of his fights are awesome. Zelios is okay. It's basically just Serenon from Federation Force again. Basically the exact same thing. Carvex is forgettable. Phaneros is awesome, but he doesn't really attack you. He kind of just stays stationary. The Omega Griever is kind of generic. Nothing really stand out or unique about it. It's not like the Omega Pirate where you can recall it instantly from memory. Keratis, again, nothing unique. It curls up and rolls into a ball. The bosses are fun, but not memorable. The Varmus thing in the desert that jumps out of the sand, cool concept, but it's ultimately kind of annoying because it's difficult to get behind the enemy, and every time you do, he ends up jumping all the way across the arena, and you have to chase him, and he comes all the way back. It just kind of becomes annoying. And the spitter, the lava spitter thing that steals an energy tank, that's a cool gimmick. I like that they reused some music from the tutorial area for the bike. But again, it drags out because the thing, you're just chasing it for ages, and the coolness and the fun factor of it just becomes annoying because you're there for like 10 minutes just wanting it to end. And that's kind of how it feels with most of the bosses. They're not really all that great. They're fine at best, with the exception of Psyux, who is a standout boss. So the Great Mines ultimately are a fun area, and they make better use of your abilities than I think some of the other areas do. And they're the one area of the game that doesn't have a stupid name. But again, the boss fight just kind of, it's a nothing burger. I like how all the Marines accompany you, and you get separated from them all at different stages, and that's fun. It adds a realism and a depth to it, and you're fighting alongside them. That's great. Love all of that. That's probably the biggest reason why the Mines is so memorable, apart from it being themed around sound and audio. The other areas don't really have that. You encounter the NPCs and you protect them from enemies, but that's kind of it. And Mackenzie being the weakest character shows, because he does nothing but stay behind a base camp the entire game. Granted, they make up for this with, their fate at the end, which I'll talk about in a moment, but with that out the way, it's time to move on to the final area, which, again, it's just Chrono Tower with a few extra rooms, so not much else to say. So with that, we kind of move on to the end of the game and Psyux. And at first, I was kind of annoyed because during my first playthrough, I was like, I got to the credits and I was like, we didn't get Psylux's backstory. What happened there? And, you know, Samus has all these kind of visions throughout the game, but you see them for like 5 or 10 seconds. And I thought they were visions of the future of like the Marines, your NPCs like dying in some future battle. But no, it was only afterwards from looking it up online that those are like Psylux's backstory. And then, you know, I had to tap the amiibo then to see the full thing. But you get to see Psylux's backstory. And, you know, Psylux as a character was hyped up for the last 20 years, you know, as being someone important. Metroid Prime 4, when it releases, is going to heavily focus on the backstory between him and Samus. And he turns out to be a complete nobody. Like, the boss fight, awesome. Very little I can complain about, but the character itself, not only is he completely absent the entirety of the game, 3 of the times you fight him, it's actually a robot and not the real thing. You finally, his backstory is in some optional cutscene, and instead of being someone important, like, say, Samus's brother, you know, which would have been the logical option, he's some nobody. He's a soldier who, his own arrogance got his men killed, and then Samus rescued him, and he hates her because of that. What? That's not motivation. That tells me nothing. That's it's like the whole thing with, and I cannot believe I'm making this comparison, Rey's parents in the Star Wars sequels. You know, we're hyping them up to be something, and then they're completely nobodies, and, you know, then there's the whole Darth Sidious thing. But, you know, the same thing, just this character is nothing. What does he look like under the armor? Fucked if I know. Why does he hate Samus, you know? Why was he so interested in that space pirate weapon? I don't know. Why does his suit have a morph ball function in the form of the lockjaw? Still not explained. You know, he upgrades his suit with nanotechnology, and you might assume that's the explanation, but that was an upgrade to his basic suit. His basic suit, which he had in Metroid Prime Hunters, also had the lockjaw. So the lockjaw, as a usable feature, unexplained. It just, that really pissed me off. Him just turning out to be a complete nobody. Because he has a voice and he talks and it's great, but he's nobody. All interest in this character is suddenly washed away because other than having a really awesome boss fight and one of the coolest boss fights in the entire franchise, the guy is nothing. He sits away in his tower for the entire game, like Ganondorf, by the way, from most of the Zelda games, you know. And yeah, they tried to give him psychic powers and all of that, but why is he absent the entire game? You know, for a story that was supposed to be built around this character and his relationship to Samus, they sure don't have anything in common. And it's implied Samus doesn't even remember him or know who he is. So from her perspective, she's just like, what's going on here? And also, speaking of Samus, why does she not talk throughout this whole game? That's the biggest concern. The biggest problem with the NPCs isn't that they talk so much, is that she says nothing. Even if she said a few words, or even if she nodded her head or acknowledged it instead of just standing there, would be better. But no, she's just awkwardly there. And the funny thing is, I've seen a lot of people online wishing that, like, she spoke in, like, the level of Other M, because it's just so awkward having her not say anything. And I was saying this for years anyway. I'm tired of silent protagonists. I think they're not fun. They're not interesting. It's 2026 now. We should not have silent protagonists. Samus is a character who talks. Samus just does nothing. Why is she silent? She should be at least saying a few words. I was already annoyed in Metroid Dread that she only had like one sentence. But here is just inexcusable, and I'm glad much of the Metroid fandom is getting a bit of common sense here, and that, yeah, she should be speaking. It's one of this game's biggest problems, is that she does not speak. Any semblance of a character is just gone. And one of the other things, in terms of suits, just randomly popped into my head. You know, the legacy suit's the final item you get in the game. And it's really funny and poetic how it looks like the light suit, and just like the light suit, you get it at the very end of the game when you don't need it anymore. Where it's the light suit was basically used to teleport, but like you could only do it to the control rooms of each area, right? And that was its limited function. The legacy suit, you can create like missiles to defend yourself, and yeah, I guess it's meant to be used when fighting Psyux, but he just bypasses it anyway. One attack from him destroys the barrier. And on hard mode, this didn't help me at all. I was using a lot of my missiles to defend myself, but he was just breaking my shielding. So just like the light suit, once again, we have a really awesome white themed power suit that you get at the very end of the game that has no practical purpose and just is wasted. Oh my god. Yeah, now my frustrations with this game are starting to come through. I've been speaking on it with mostly a mixed opinion up to now, but I'm really going to start kind of cutting into it here. So you have that really cool fight. Mackenzie takes a bullet for you. And then you teleport. They all hold Psyux back. Samus is back on Tanimar. She plants the tree and surrenders the psychic crystal and the legacy suit, and the game ends. That is the ending. It doesn't end on a cliffhanger like every game in the Prime trilogy did. It doesn't end on a definitive note either. It just stops without resolution to anything. Are the people who stay behind in Viros dead? The implication is that they can't... You need psychic abilities to use the Master Teleporter. Psyux has them. The Marines don't, so if Psyux can get away, I guess they're all going to be dead. But the other thing that bugs me about this ending is... So the Nintendo interview, right? The Famitsu thing mentioned that like Prime 4 is meant... Viros is in another dimension. That is not at all what the game implies. The game kind of beats you over the head with the fact that Viros is Tanimar in the distant past. They're the same planet. You see holograms of Tanimar and you see holograms of Viros, and they're identical. They're in the same place with the same number of moons. So it's implied that Samus at the end actually traveled further back in history. The sacred tree and the prophecy of the chosen one exists because Samus was the one that originally planted the tree 6,000 years ago, and that's why she's the chosen one. So the ending is Samus going back in time, millennia. That's why Tanimar looks so desolate, why there's no life anywhere. But no, apparently that's not the case. Apparently Viros is actually a different dimension, which, you know, if a planet is in a different dimension, that means it must have an entire universe, which, you know, opens fucking floodgates for a multiverse. So they turn Metroid into a fucking multiverse story. This is my biggest problem with the game. What the fuck is up with the storytelling? And like the interview mentions that Metroid Prime 4 takes place after Super and before Other M, which is not possible because, you know, there's Metroids and there's space pirates, so it would be before Super Metroid. And Samus in Other M never mentions traveling to a different dimension, but according to Nintendo, assuming this isn't a translation error, which I think it's a translation error, and I bloody hope so, but if it's not, and we accept it at face value, how How do you explain that plot hole? Nintendo claims, oh yeah, we can have Metroid Prime games exist in a different dimension, but they can happen at any point in the Metroid timeline. No, because then you've the whole thing with Metroids not being extinct, and if this continues on to, if Prime 5 or 6 takes place at the same time as Dread and there's Metroids, suddenly Metroid Dread feels weird. And this, anyone who knows anything about Metroid knows that this game cannot possibly be after Super Metroid. It creates so many plot holes. And yet that's probably why the date is 20X9, which is 3 years after Federation Force. Because Super Metroid's manual stated that Super Metroid took place in 20X9. So my assumption that they just changed the date because they wanted to space games out seems to be out the window. And it's no, they changed the date because they actually wanted to canonize Super Metroid being in that year, and now this game happens alongside it. That's genuinely the most stupid thing. Metroid Prime 4 is a great game held back by some really baffling decisions. Its new features like Viola and the psychic abilities are novel, but they don't add anything new. They're kind of pointless. They're like the Aeon abilities in Samus Returns. They're used once and then they have no other purpose in the game, and they basically are pointless additions that should have been cut. And then, very interestingly, that interview also mentioned Metroid Prime 4 started as an open world game. And it also seems to imply that Retro inherited part of the concept from Bandai Namco, even though Nintendo kind of told us that, Retro had started from scratch. But that deserves its whole other video, because this video was very long already, so I'll talk about that in the next video. But if that's the case, then it sounds like they really missed the mark on what a Metroid game should be. It is fun. Its core gameplay is classic Metroid Prime, and it's fun and it's satisfying. And the areas, the music is great, just it's inappropriately used. And the areas are fun to traverse and they all feel unique, except for Volt Forge. But, the boss fights are just kind of forgettable. And outside of the Great Mines, there's really not all that memorable about the different areas, except Fury Green, because it's the strongest area and it's the opening level and it's there for 2 minutes. I don't know if those characters are dead. If they are, it makes kind of thematic sense, because everyone Samus meets always seems to die. And, Mackenzie taking well, it's not really a bullet, but Mackenzie taking a shot for Samus, if he dies from that, it kind of adds something to his character. I don't know if in Metroid Prime 5, Nintendo or Retro plan on revisiting Viros, because that comment about keeping the Prime games in a different dimension has me worried that we're going to revisit the same planet again. And I guess that's the implication. Also, because I know someone's going to mention it in the comments, the logo of the game is the artifact from the beginning of the game, right? That artifact at the beginning that teleports everyone to Viros clearly isn't the Master Teleporter, because even though it looks like it, it is a completely different size. So where does this teleporter relic come from? Well, Chitoya's messages mention that 12 other Lemorn left Viros to search for the Chosen One, and they never came back. Presumably they left Viros via the Master Teleporter, but if they did find the Chosen One, how would they have gotten back? Suddenly it makes sense. They all probably had their own pocket teleporters. One of them ended up on Tanimar. When that Lemorn died, that teleporter was buried for however many years until the Federation discovered it. And this is kind of backed up by the fact you get Takabi gives you this teleporter chip, which lets you, teleport the mech parts back to base camp. And when it's teleporting, it does the same shape as the logo. So small-scale teleporter technology is something the Lemorn had. And yeah, that relic at the beginning of the game, which I would have thought would have played a bigger role in the story, is probably just some pocket-sized teleporter for one of the Lemorn that went into space. Overall, I really enjoyed the game. It is fun. I wasn't furiously disappointed like a lot of people were. I was annoyed about the lack of a story. I was baffled by the lack of Metroids and space pirates. So in many ways I was disappointed. I wasn't heavily disappointed. To me, it's a good game, but it's definitely the weakest Prime game. At least mainline Prime game. But if the thing about the timeline is true, that will change my opinion on the game. Because if we get an official translation and they still say it's set after Super Metroid, I don't know about you, but I can't believe I'm going to say this. I'm going to end up resenting this game because that creates so many plot holes, and I don't want Metroid Prime to be a different dimension and I don't want a multiverse in Metroid. Please, fuck no. We saw what Bayonetta did, and there's a lot of similarities to Bayonetta 3 and Metroid Prime 4. It's actually uncanny. But we saw how badly a multiverse fucked up that franchise. It does not belong in Metroid. No. So, if that's the route they're going, then I almost find myself wishing they didn't make Metroid Prime 4. They should have probably left it at 3, because if they weren't going to follow up Psylux's story properly, then what was the point? And the Nintendo, it's presumably Tanabe in that interview, he implies that Psylux's story wasn't ever known. They made up the character and they wanted to do more with him, but they didn't have a backstory for him. Whereas past interviews, he alluded that they did have a backstory. They were just waiting for the right time to tell it. So if this interview is true, it means they didn't have a story. They just wanted to do something with him, and they made it up on the fly. And that unfortunately explains so much. It explains why he's absent the entire game. Why his backstory is tacked on and he's just some complete nobody instead of an important figure to the Metroid lore. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond it's a great game with some weird design choices, but it's also a game that's probably going to have a bad legacy in that it's going to negatively impact the franchise going forward. In terms of storytelling and continuity, we'll see how that pans out. But all in all, to end this review, because it's long enough, I enjoyed my time with Metroid Prime 4. It was good, but it should have been so much better. Yeah, there was a lot of underbaked, half-baked, and a lot of ideas that should have been cut. And I don't know what the hell was up with the naming scheme. Green Crystal, Green Energy, Fury Green Volt Forge, Ice Belt, Flare Pool, Chrono Tower. Whoever came up with those names just should be fired. I cannot believe those names made it past early development. I genuinely cannot. But alas, that is going to be it for my review. As I said, next video I'll talk more about the timeline implications, and I'll probably sound a bit more negative about the game there. So yeah, stay tuned for that, I guess. So yeah, with that all said, still can't believe I'm talking about this game, but here we are. So yeah, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And yeah, with that all said, Nova Scorvius out.